Seth is a pivotal figure in early human history, primarily because of the faithful line that stems from him and eventually leads to Noah, and by extension, to key figures later highlighted in the Bible. According to JW.org and related Watchtower Society publications, like Insight on the Scriptures, Seth represents a kind of spiritual restart, or hope after the tragic events involving his older brothers, Cain and Abel. Biblical account and significance. Seth is introduced in the book of Genesis shortly after the account of Cain killing Abel. In Genesis chapter 4 verse 25, New World Translation, Eve names her newborn son Seth, saying, God has appointed another offspring in place of Abel. The Hebrew name, Seth, can be understood to mean, appointed, or placed, reflecting Eve's acknowledgement that Jehovah had provided another son to carry on a faithful lineage. Cain's rebellious act in killing Abel left Adam and Eve with a legacy of sorrow. Abel, the son who had displayed sincere devotion to Jehovah, was gone. Cain, who murdered his brother, was alienated from his family and from Jehovah. This context highlights why the birth of Seth was so significant. It provided a renewed path for worship of Jehovah to continue among mankind. The line of descent. According to Genesis chapter 5, Seth became father to Enosh. From Enosh forward, the Bible tracks a line of faithful men leading eventually to Noah, making Seth the direct ancestor of every human being who survived the global flood. Jehovah's Witnesses draw attention to the genealogical lists in the Scriptures, noting how these genealogies are not mere records of names, but highlight a pattern of faith and obedience to God that continues through the line of Seth. The genealogies provided in the early chapters of Genesis emphasize Seth's importance as part of the lineage that later produced such individuals as Enoch, who walked with the true God, and Noah, who survived the flood. Thus, when Jehovah's Witnesses discuss Old Testament personalities, they see Seth as the early root for faithful worship that developed during a time when many other humans were slipping into violence and rebellion. Legacy of true worship. Jehovah's Witnesses believe the very concept of worshiping Jehovah as the true God made an important pivot with Seth. Genesis chapter 4 verse 26, NWT, says that in his days, people began calling on the name of Jehovah. Watchtower publications have examined this phrase in detail. Some interpret this as meaning that, under Seth's influence, there was an intensified or perhaps more organized form of calling upon God's personal name, Jehovah. It contrasts with the path taken by Cain's descendants, who eventually embraced violence and disregard for divine standards. It's worth noting that Jehovah's Witnesses see the name, Jehovah, as the personal name of God, and the example of Seth's line is used to show how using God's name and upholding true worship is pivotal even at the earliest stages of human history. By tying Seth to the beginnings of a public declaration of God's name, Jehovah's Witnesses underscore that from the very beginning, a dividing line existed between those who sought God's favor and those who distanced themselves from him. Seth versus Cain. A natural contrast arises between Seth's family line and Cain's. While Cain's line is depicted as gradually descending into more violence and godlessness, Seth's line is portrayed as staying relatively close to Jehovah. Eventually, if you fast forward through Genesis, you see how the world population grew corrupted as time went on, culminating in the flood of Noah's day. However, from Seth through Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, and ultimately down to Noah, Jehovah's Witnesses view this lineage as preserving the knowledge of God, passing down divine truths, and upholding a form of worship that tried to remain loyal to Jehovah. Role in Messianic prophecy. Jehovah's Witnesses often discuss how the lineage described in the Hebrew Scriptures ties in with the eventual promise of a Messiah. The line of Seth continued to pass along, leading ultimately to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and eventually to Jesus Christ. While the genealogical lists in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 3 verses 23 to 38, trace Jesus' ancestry back to Adam and Eve, they do so by way of Seth. According to Watchtower publications, this underscores that Jehovah carefully preserved the line that would bring about the promised offspring, mentioned back in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. The concept of the seed, or offspring, is pivotal in Jehovah's Witness theology. They see Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 as the very first prophecy in Scripture, God's promise that eventually a deliverer would crush the serpent, symbolizing Satan. Seth becomes part of the fabric of that promise. While the identity of that seed culminates in Jesus Christ, The genealogical detail in Genesis emphasizes why preserving faithful lines of descent was so important. Lifespan and death. In Genesis chapter 5, we read that Seth lived a total of 912 years. For Jehovah's Witnesses, these lifespans in the early chapters of Genesis are taken as literal. They view these accounts as historically reliable and see the extended lifespans of pre-flood humans as part of the original design for humans to live much longer, if not forever, had sin not entered the world. Seth's recorded death at 912 years highlights that even righteous humans eventually succumb to the imperfection introduced by Adam and Eve's disobedience. Practical lessons. Jehovah's Witnesses often draw lessons from Seth's life for modern believers. Faith in adverse circumstances. Seth was born into a family scarred by tragedy. Yet Jehovah provided him as a new hope, demonstrating that God's purpose can move forward regardless of setbacks. Please share and like and please subscribe.